My name is Walter Gaines. I'm 63 years old, and I spent 4 years of my life caring for my wife, who I believed was disappearing one memory at a time. I want to tell you what happened 11 days ago, because I still can't fully explain it to myself. I need to say it out loud to someone, anyone, before it drowns me. The morning it all changed started like every other morning had started for the last 4 years. My alarm went off at 5:45, not because I needed to be anywhere. I hadn't needed to be anywhere since I retired from the civil engineering firm 3 years ago. The alarm went off because my wife needed her first medications at 6, and in 4 years I had never once let that clock run past its mark. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment the way I always did, just breathing. The house was still dark. We live in a small town in eastern Kentucky, 20 minutes outside of Harlan, and in the early morning, you can hear the creek running behind the property and nothing else. 4 years ago, that sound used to comfort me. These days, I barely heard it. I had learned to keep my mind moving because stillness left too much room for grief. I put on my slippers, wrapped myself in the flannel robe my daughter had given me the last Christmas we spent together as a whole family, and walked down the hallway to the room we had converted into a medical space when my wife came home from the hospital. Carol was already awake. She often was before I got there. She'd be lying with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, which the doctors had told me was common with her type of cognitive impairment. The stroke had been sudden and severe, they said. It had affected the hippocampus and the regions responsible for executive function. Some days she knew my face. Some days she didn't. On her good days, she could say my name and hold a short conversation before the fog rolled back in. On her bad days, she looked at me like I was a stranger who had wandered into her room. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said. She blinked at me. Not the blinking of someone confused, just a slow, deliberate acknowledgement. I had learned to read her eyes the way you learn to read a river by watching it long enough to understand what every ripple means. I opened the curtains a few inches to let in the gray early light. Then I went through the routine. Medications first. The 7-pill organizer her neurologist had prescribed, sorted every Sunday evening into their daily compartments. Then the morning wash, warm water, unscented soap, the same pale blue washcloth we'd been using since I ordered a 12-pack online 2 years ago. Then I'd help her sit up, arrange her pillows, and talk to her while I prepared her breakfast. I talked to her about everything. About the creek, about the weather, about what I planned to do that day. The specialist told me early on that familiar voices and consistent conversation could help preserve cognitive function, and even if they were wrong, talking to her made me feel less alone in all of it. "Do you know what today is?" I asked her while I stirred the oatmeal on the stovetop. "It's Thursday. Our granddaughter's birthday is next week. I was thinking we could have Dennis bring over that chocolate cake you always liked from the bakery in town." I thought I saw something flicker across her face when I mentioned my brother's name. A tightening around the eyes. I told myself it was nothing. I was always telling myself things were nothing. My brother Dennis had been my closest support through everything. He was 4 years younger than me, still working as an insurance adjuster, and he had stepped in immediately when Carol had the stroke. He'd driven her to appointments when I couldn't manage the vehicle and the wheelchair at the same time. He'd helped me navigate the medical paperwork, the insurance claims, the trust my father-in-law had established years ago for Carol's benefit. He was always there. I never questioned it. He was my brother. Carol's younger sister, Renee, was the other constant presence in our life. She called every few days and visited twice a month, always bringing something: flowers, a casserole, a new kind of herbal tea she'd read was good for brain health. She was warm and attentive, and she frequently reminded me how much better Carol would be in a professional memory care facility. "She wouldn't have to rely on you so completely," Renee would say, touching my arm with what felt like genuine tenderness. "You could visit every day. You'd be able to sleep, Walter. You look exhausted." "I am exhausted," I would answer. "But she's my wife. She's staying home." Renee would nod and let it go. For a while. The morning that changed everything, she had called before 8 o'clock. "I wanted to remind you that the facility in Lexington has an opening," she said. "I spoke with the director last week. Carol would have her own room, a garden view. The staff ratio is excellent. We've talked about this," I said. "I know, but you have to think about yourself too, Walter. You're not getting any younger. What happens if you get sick? What happens to Carol then?" I have Dennis, I said. There was a pause on her end. Yes, she said finally. You have Dennis. Something about the way she said it made me uneasy, but I couldn't have told you why. I put it out of my mind. I had learned to put a lot of things out of my mind just to get through the day. After breakfast, I helped Carol with her stretches. The physical therapist had stopped coming 18 months ago, around the same time my daughter Joanna disappeared, but I had kept up the routine on my own. Then I settled her in her chair by the window with the classical station playing softly on the radio, and I went to make myself coffee. That's when I noticed the pill bottle on the kitchen counter. It was small, amber-colored, the kind of generic prescription bottle you'd pick up at any pharmacy. But it wasn't one of Carol's 7. I knew her medications the way I knew my own hands. I had filled and refilled those prescriptions for 4 years. This one had a label I'd never seen, partially torn away as if someone had tried to remove it. The dosage information was gone. Only a partial lot number remained. I stood there for a long moment holding it. Then I walked back to Carol's room. Honey, I said softly, crouching beside her chair. Did someone give you this? She looked at the bottle. Her eyes went very still in the way they did when something was happening inside her that she couldn't express. Then slowly, deliberately, she raised her right hand, the hand that retained the most mobility, and she pointed toward the door, the direction of the hallway, the direction of the guest room my brother always used when he stayed over. My brother had stayed 2 nights ago. I called Carol's neurologist, Dr. Patricia Webb, before 9 o'clock. She was the 3rd physician Carol had seen since the original diagnosis. The first, a Dr. Emery, had retired unexpectedly 2 years into Carol's treatment. His replacement had moved to a practice in Nashville after less than a year. Patricia Webb had taken over from there, and she was thorough, careful, and direct, all the things I needed her to be. I found a medication I don't recognize, I told her. I think someone may have been giving Carol something outside of her prescribed regimen. There was a careful silence on her end. Bring her in today, Walter. I want to run a full panel. I had Carol dressed and in the car by 10. The drive to the medical center was 40 minutes, and I talked to her the whole way about the mountains, about the color of the leaves starting to turn, about Joanna, the way I always eventually talked about Joanna, because not talking about her felt like agreeing that she was really gone. My daughter had been 34 when she left. She'd been working remotely as a bookkeeper, coming over to help me with Carol 2 or 3 times a week. Then one day in March, 18 months ago, I'd gotten a text message saying she'd accepted a position with a company in Seattle and was leaving immediately. No phone call, no goodbye in person, just a text, and then silence. The police had investigated and found nothing suspicious. She was an adult who had chosen to move on, they told me. People do it all the time. I never believed it. Joanna wouldn't have left without hugging Carol. She wouldn't have left without standing in this driveway and crying. Because that's who she was, a woman who felt everything fully and never pretended otherwise. The Joanna who sent that text message was not the daughter I raised. But I had no proof. Just a father's certainty, which doesn't count for much. Dr. Webb met us at the entrance herself, which I appreciated. She had a gentle manner with Carol, speaking slowly and clearly, maintaining eye contact. She asked me to wait in the consultation lounge while her team ran the tests, and I sat there for 2 hours with cold coffee and a magazine I didn't read. When the door finally opened and Dr. Webb walked out with a colleague, I didn't recognize a younger man with the serious expression of someone carrying information he wishes he didn't have. My stomach dropped before she said a single word. "Walter," she said, "we need to talk somewhere private." In the small room with the door closed, Dr. Webb set a folder on the table but didn't open it. "The bottle you brought me this morning," she began. "We've identified the compound. It's a combination of benzodiazepine derivatives and a synthetic sedative that isn't commonly prescribed in this country. It's not on Carol's medical chart. It has never been prescribed to her by any physician at this facility." "What is it doing?" I asked. "It's suppressing cognitive function," her colleague said. "Specifically, the kind of high-dose long-term administration we're seeing in Carol's blood work would produce symptoms very consistent with moderate to severe dementia. Confusion, memory gaps, emotional blunting, difficulty with language and motor coordination." The room was completely silent. I could hear my own heartbeat. "Are you telling me?" I said slowly. That my wife doesn't have dementia. Doctor? Webb looked at me with steady, careful eyes. What I'm telling you is that the neurological damage we attributed to her stroke 4 years ago is not consistent with what we're seeing today. Her MRI shows far less structural impairment than her original scans indicated. And the substances in her bloodstream are not consistent with natural disease progression. They are consistent with deliberate, sustained chemical sedation. I put both hands flat on the table. I needed to feel something solid. Someone has been poisoning her, the colleague said. Not to kill her, to keep her incapacitated. Walter, Dr. Webb said gently, I need you to call the police. Those words hit me the same way. I imagine a car accident hits you one moment, ordinary life, and then the world is simply different and you cannot go back. I sat in that consultation room with a detective named Sandra Okafor for almost 3 hours. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to listen without reacting, and she asked every question twice, from 2 different angles, the way good detectives do. I told her everything from the beginning. The stroke 4 years ago, Carol had collapsed at home while I was visiting a job site 2 counties over. Dennis had been the one to find her. Dennis had called the ambulance. Dennis had been at the hospital when I arrived, and the original physician, Dr. Emery, had delivered the diagnosis that night. Severe ischemic stroke. Significant and likely permanent cognitive impairment. I remembered the way the word permanent had landed in my chest like a stone. Tell me about your brother's relationship with your wife, Detective Okafor said. They always got along, I said. Carol thought he was funny. He made her laugh. There was never any conflict. And her family property? I paused. Carol's father had owned 300 acres in the valley before he died 6 years ago. The land had been in the family since before the Civil War. He'd left it jointly to Carol and Renee, with a provision that it couldn't be sold without both signatures. As Carol's husband and legal guardian, a status I'd been given after she became incapacitated, I technically held her signing authority over the property. A highway project, I said, understanding arriving like cold water. There's been a state highway expansion under discussion for the last 3 years. If the route goes through the valley, that land would be worth considerably more than it is now. The detective finished. We've been tracking that project. The route was finalized 8 months ago, and the land assessments in that corridor have gone up significantly. Who would know about that before it became public? My brother works in insurance, I said. He has contacts in county government. He would know. The detective wrote something down. And your daughter's disappearance, 18 months ago. Tell me about that. By the time I finished, the detective's notebook was half full. She stood up and put her card in my hand. I'm placing an officer outside your wife's room, she said. I'd like you to go home with an escort, and I need you to behave as if nothing has changed. Don't contact your brother. Don't contact Renee. Don't tell anyone what we've discussed here today. What about my wife? Can I talk to her? Dr. Webb has stopped all non-prescribed medications as of this morning. Depending on how quickly her system clears, she may begin to be more responsive within 24 to 48 hours. She looked at me steadily. Walter, whatever she tells you when she's lucid, be prepared for it to be difficult. I drove home with a police officer following at a distance, and I sat in my driveway for a long time looking at the house I had lived in for 31 years. The same house where Carol and I had raised Joanna after her mother and I divorced. The same house where I had spent 4 years believing my wife was vanishing piece by piece, talking to her every morning because I refused to give up on the chance she could still hear me. Someone had taken those 4 years from me on purpose. I went inside and I sat at the kitchen table and I did not sleep at all that night. My brother called the next morning at 8, which was unusual. He typically called in the evenings. How's Carol? He asked. I noticed you took her to the doctor yesterday. He had eyes in that hospital. Or he had spoken to Renee. Either way, the normalcy of his voice made my jaw clench. Routine visit, I said. She had a respiratory thing. Nothing serious. You should have called me. I would have come with you. It was nothing, Dennis. I'm fine. There was a brief pause. You sound tired. I'm always tired, I said. He laughed the way he always laughed, warm and easy, and I realized I had heard that laugh 10,000 times and never once doubted it. When we hung up, I went to the bathroom and ran cold water over my wrists for a long time. Detective Okafor called me at noon. She wanted me to come back to the medical center. When I arrived, Dr. Webb met me in the hallway outside Carol's room with an expression that told me something had shifted. "She's been asking for you," the doctor said quietly. "By name. Coherent sentences. Her processing is still slower than normal, and she'll tire quickly, but she's substantially more responsive than she was yesterday." I stood outside that door for a moment with my hand on the frame. 4 years of one kind of marriage. Whatever was waiting on the other side of that door was something entirely different. Carol was sitting up. She looked smaller than I remembered her looking before everything, and older, and there were lines around her mouth that hadn't been there 4 years ago. But her eyes were clear, not the glazed, distant expression I had spent 4 years interpreting. Her eyes were fully present, and when she saw me, they filled with tears so fast she didn't have time to blink them back. "Walter," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse, but steady. I crossed the room and took her hand. I couldn't find a single word. "How long?" I finally managed. She understood exactly what I was asking. 4 years, 2 months, she said. She knew it precisely. She had been counting. "Carol," I said, "why didn't you try to warn me?" She closed her eyes. When she opened them, the tears were running freely, and she wasn't trying to stop them. At the beginning, I did try. You remember when I would get agitated? When I would try to speak, and it came out wrong? I was trying to tell you something was wrong. But Dennis was always there. Or Renee. One of them was always there. And whenever I came too close to saying something real, the dose would go up. "The bottle I found on the counter," I said. "I managed to hide some of the pills," she said. Over the last few weeks, I'd been getting small windows of clarity when the levels dropped low enough, and I started holding tablets under my tongue when they thought I'd swallowed them. I hid them in a coffee tin at the back of the cabinet above the refrigerator. I knew you cleaned there every spring. I was hoping you'd find them. "I found the ones on the counter," I said. "Those were the overflow. I ran out of space in the tin." Detective Okafor stepped forward gently from her position near the window. "Mrs. Gaines, can you tell us who was administering the medication and how they initially got you into this situation?" Carol looked at the detective and then back at me, steadying herself. "There was no stroke," she said. "I was drugged at dinner. Dennis had come over for Sunday dinner, and Renee had been there too. I remember feeling wrong within an hour, dizzy and confused in a way that was nothing like any dizziness I'd ever felt. I remember falling. I remember Dennis on the phone calling for help. And then I was in the hospital, and there was a doctor named Emery telling me I'd had a severe neurological event and that I needed to cooperate with my treatment if I wanted to give myself the best chance of recovery." "Cooperate," the detective repeated. "He came to my room alone the second night," Carol continued. "He told me that if I didn't comply with what he called the treatment protocol, there would be consequences for Walter. He said Dennis had people who could make things very difficult for my husband. He said the simplest thing for everyone was for me to be a good patient, let the process work, and my husband would be safe." "And you believed him?" I said. It wasn't an accusation. I just needed to understand. She looked at me with those clear, exhausted eyes. "They knew things, Walter. Where you went. When you left the property. Dennis would come in and tell me where you'd been the day before, what you'd had for lunch, details that proved someone was watching you. I was terrified. I thought about 4 years of morning routines, 4 years of talking to her about the creek and the weather and what I planned to do that day. She had heard every word. She had been lying there, fully aware, unable to answer, afraid that answering would get me killed. The land," Detective Okafor said. "When did you understand what this was really about?" "About 2 years in," Carol said. "I heard Dennis talking on the phone in the guest room. He didn't know I was having one of my clearer windows. He was talking to someone about the highway assessment and how the land value would be different in 2 years when the route was announced. He said something about the timeline working in their favor." "Your sister Renee was also involved?" I asked. Carol's face changed. Renee was Dennis's idea. He recruited her early on. She'd always been difficult with money debt, poor decisions, a gambling habit she hid from the family for years. He offered to clear her debts if she helped manage the situation. She was the one who controlled my appointments, made sure the doctor who replaced Emery never ran the specific blood work that would reveal what was in my system. And she was the one who kept pushing you to put me in a facility. "Because in a facility you'd be completely out of my control," I said slowly. I'd have signed the land over to facilitate your care costs. They'd have gotten everything. Carol nodded. And then the doctor says I decline quickly, and within a year or two there's a quiet funeral, and by then the highway project is public, and the land is worth 4 times what it was. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system. I need to ask about Joanna, I said. My voice didn't sound like my voice. Carol closed her eyes. It took her a moment to open them. Your daughter started noticing things, she said. She was sharp, Walter. She started questioning the medication labels, started asking why my blood work was never comprehensive. She told me she was going to find out what was really happening to me. And then she disappeared, I said. She didn't go to Seattle, Carol said. She found something I don't know what, and she confronted your brother about it. 3 days later, she was gone, and I received a visit from Dennis telling me that my cooperation was no longer optional. He showed me a photograph. Joanna, alive, but clearly frightened. I gripped the bed rail. Do you know where she is? He mentioned a property once, in a careless moment. Something about the old Sullen Creek hunting cabin. He and Ray used to hunt up there in the fall. Ray, I repeated. Raymond Durley, my friend of 40 years. My college roommate. The man who had driven 4 hours to sit with me at the hospital the night Carol collapsed. The man who had called me every week for the first year of Carol's illness to check on me, who had brought me whiskey and watched football with me and told me he was proud of the way I was handling everything. Ray introduced Dennis to Dr. Emery, Carol said quietly. They went to the same church years ago. I don't know how deep his involvement goes, but he's connected. I sat down in the chair next to her bed because my legs stopped working properly. 40 years, I said. I said it to no one in particular. 40 years. Detective Okafor was already on her phone. The next several hours moved in a way that felt simultaneously very fast and terribly slow. The detective informed me that arrest warrants were being prepared for Dennis and Renee, and that a search warrant for the Sullen Creek property was being expedited based on Carol's testimony about Joanna. Ray's financials were being pulled. I want to come, I told the detective when she briefed me on the plan to approach the cabin. You're not a law enforcement officer, Mr. Gaines. She's my daughter, I said. Detective Okafor looked at me for a long moment. You'll stay with the support team outside the perimeter. You don't move until I give the word. It was a 2.5-hour drive to the Sullen Creek area, and I rode in a vehicle with 2 plainclothes officers while tactical units moved separately. The roads got narrower the further we went into the eastern hills, and by the time we turned onto the gravel track that led toward the old cabin, the light was going amber and low. We stopped about a quarter-mile out. Through the trees, I could see the roofline and 2 vehicles parked outside a truck I recognized as Dennis's and a dark sedan I couldn't place. The tactical team deployed without a word. I stood by the vehicle with a female officer named Bates who had the kind of steady presence that made you feel, irrationally, that things might be all right. What if she's not there? I said. Officer Bates didn't answer, which was probably the most honest thing she could have done. The radio crackled. Movement inside. 2 confirmed adult subjects, searching for additional occupants. Then a long silence that lasted about 90 seconds and felt like 90 minutes. Then, 2 suspects in custody. 1 additional occupant located. Adult female, conscious, responsive. I was already moving before Officer Bates could step in front of me. She didn't try to stop me. The inside of the cabin was small and smelled like damp wood and kerosene. Dennis was on the floor with his hands being secured, his face a color I had never seen on him, gray, deflated, the face of a man whose plan has finally run out of road. He looked up at me as I passed and started to say something. I didn't stop to hear it. In the back room, a small space with a cot, a single window, and a battery-powered lantern, my daughter was sitting upright with a tactical officer crouching in front of her. She had lost weight. She had a bruise along her jaw that was old enough to have yellowed at the edges. She looked up when I came through the door, and for a half-second her face went blank with shock, and then it broke completely open. "Dad," she said. I crossed the room and held her, and I did not let go for a long time. She was shaking. I was shaking. The officer stepped quietly out of the room to give us a moment. "Carol," she kept saying. "Is Carol okay? Is she alive?" "She's alive," I said. "She's at the medical center." "She's been talking, Joanna." "She's been talking in full sentences." Joanna pulled back enough to look at my face. The tears were running down hers, and she didn't wipe them. She looked exactly like the daughter I had raised, the one who felt everything fully and never pretended otherwise. "I found the prescription records," she said. "I found the billing codes Dr. Emery had been using, and they didn't match any of Carol's documented diagnoses. When I confronted your brother—" "You don't have to explain right now," I said. "He said he'd hurt you if I told anyone. He said he had people watching the house." "I know," I said. "It's over now." Detective Okafor appeared in the doorway. She didn't say anything, just gave me a nod that confirmed what I already knew everyone was accounted for. I learned the full scope of it in pieces over the following days. The way you learn about a disaster, never all at once, always in increments that let you absorb one layer before the next one arrives. Dennis had been the architect. He had discovered the preliminary highway route assessments through a contact at the county planning office 18 months before any public announcement. He had run the numbers and understood exactly what Carol's land would be worth once the route was confirmed. Since Carol and Renee shared title, he needed both of them cooperating. Renee he bought with debt relief and a promise of a cut. The problem was me. As Carol's husband, I had considerable legal standing over her affairs, and I was the kind of man who asked questions and read paperwork carefully. I would never have agreed to sell the land. So the plan was to remove Carol from the equation entirely, make her legally incapacitated, make me her overwhelmed caregiver, and gradually maneuver me into either signing over authority or sending Carol to a facility where she would no longer be my legal responsibility in the same way. Dr. Emery had been recruited through Ray. The two of them had a history that Detective Okafor described carefully as mutually compromising, which I understood to mean they had enough on each other to ensure cooperation. Emery had falsified the initial diagnosis, established the medication protocol, and then resigned and moved abroad before anyone could scrutinize his records too closely. Ray had managed the money. Portions of Carol's medical trust established by her father to provide for exactly this kind of situation had been redirected through a shell company Ray controlled, flowing into accounts that eventually funded Dennis's operation, including the cost of keeping Joanna detained. When the detective told me about Ray, I asked her to give me a minute alone, and she did. I sat in the hallway of the medical center and looked at the linoleum floor and thought about 40 years. I thought about the nights he'd sat with me in this building, in other buildings, in my living room. I thought about the phone calls and the whiskey and the football games. I thought about trust as a thing you build slowly and carefully over decades, and how it can be destroyed in the space of a single sentence. "He came to visit you so often during Carol's illness," the detective said when she came back. "You were his alibi for being in the area. Every visit gave him an opportunity to check on the operation." I didn't say anything. "He's cooperating fully now," she added. "He's providing names, financial records, the works. He says he didn't know about Joanna until after she was already detained, and that he tried to get Dennis to let her go." "Does that matter?" I asked. "Legally, somewhat," she said. "Personally, that's your business." She was right. It was my business. I haven't decided yet what to do with it. 2 weeks after the cabin, Carol was moved to a rehabilitation facility for what the doctors estimated would be a 3 to 6 month recovery. The long-term sedation had left her physically weaker than her age would suggest, and there were cognitive after-effects from the sustained chemical exposure that would need careful unwinding. But the prognosis was cautiously optimistic. She was sharp, she was determined, and she was furious, in a quiet, focused way that I recognized as the particular fury of someone who has been underestimated for a very long time. Joanna drove down from Harlan. She was staying in the house with me while she recovered, and the two of them met for the first time since before Joanna's disappearance. I stood in the doorway of Carol's room and watched them hold each other, and I thought about all the mornings I had talked to my wife about Joanna while she lay there unable to answer, and how she had listened to every word. "She knew," Joanna told me afterward. "She said every time you talked about me, she would focus everything she had on listening clearly. She said it was the only thing that kept her going sometimes." On the legal side, the case moved quickly once the cooperation started flowing. Dennis was charged with conspiracy, kidnapping, fraud, and illegal administration of controlled substances. Renee took a plea arrangement in exchange for her full account of the operation. Ray faced federal fraud and conspiracy charges on top of the state counts, and the shell company's financial records turned out to contain records that implicated 2 county officials and a state-level contract administrator who had been steering the highway route assessments for private benefit. Detective Okafor told me it was the largest corruption case to come out of that part of the state in a generation. The land is still ours. It will stay ours. About 3 weeks after the cabin, I drove out there alone to Carol's family property in the valley. I parked at the gate the way I used to park, when Carol and I would walk the fence line together in the evenings before everything. The grass was long and the light was going orange over the ridge, and the creek that runs along the southern edge was moving quietly over the stones the way it always has. I stood there for a long time thinking about what 4 years costs a person. Not just the hours and the sleep and the grief of believing you're watching someone you love disappear. I mean the other cost, the cost of trusting people completely and being completely wrong. I'm 63 years old, and I thought I understood which people in my life were solid and which ones weren't. I thought I had that map memorized. 4 years ago, someone redrew it without telling me, and I walked around the wrong map the whole time. I don't know what to do with that, except to tell you about it. Carol came home 4 months after the cabin. She walked in with a cane and Joanna on one side of her, and she stood in the doorway of our house and looked at it the way you look at something you weren't sure you'd ever see again. Then she walked to the kitchen and sat at the table and asked me to make coffee, and I did. We talked for 3 hours that first afternoon about the 4 years, about the things I'd said to her while she lay there that she'd held on to, about the things I'd missed, her voice, her opinions, the particular way she argued when she thought she was right about something, which was most of the time. There was pain in that conversation that I don't think either of us will ever fully put down. You don't go through something like this and come out unscathed on the other side. That would be a lie, and I'm too old for comfortable lies. But here's what I can tell you honestly. 3 months ago, I sat on the front porch in the early evening and Carol came and sat next to me. And we didn't say anything for a while, just listened to the creek. And she put her hand over mine the way she used to before any of this. And I thought, this is still real. Whatever was done to us, this is still real. Joanna stayed through the winter. She's decided to stay closer to home permanently. She's opened a small bookkeeping practice in Harlan, and she comes for dinner twice a week. She still flinches sometimes at unexpected sounds, and I see Carol watch her when that happens with an expression I recognize as the particular grief of a parent who knows she couldn't protect her child and can't stop apologizing for it. We're working through it. That's all I can tell you. One day at a time, which sounds like a cliche until you understand that some days the only honest unit of measurement you have left is a single day. Dennis is awaiting trial. Renee is serving time under her plea arrangement. Ray, I haven't spoken to Ray, and I don't know if I ever will again. The 40 years are not something I can simply subtract from my life. But I also can't pretend they mean what I once thought they meant. That's a kind of arithmetic I'm still learning. What I know is this. I am 63 years old. I spent 4 years of my life caring for a woman I thought was lost to me, talking to her every morning because I refused to accept that she couldn't hear me. It turns out she heard every single word. It turns out the only thing standing between her and complete darkness, some mornings, was the sound of my voice describing the creek and the weather and the color of the leaves on the ridge. If I had given up, if I had listened to my brother or to Renee and signed the papers and sent her somewhere else, I don't want to think about what would have happened. I don't have to think about it, because I didn't. That's the one thing in this entire story I can hold on to cleanly. I didn't give up. Whatever you're facing right now, whatever version of a long and exhausting and heartbreaking situation you're carrying today, I'm asking you to hold on to that same thing. Sometimes the only act of resistance available to you is just to stay, to keep showing up, to keep talking even when no one seems to be listening. Someone might be listening. If my story moved you, if something in it stayed with you, please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe to Stormborn Vengeance for more testimonies like this one. And hit that like button if you believe that some things some people are worth every last difficult day of fighting for.